Welcome back. Today we're diving into an explainer that honestly hits right at the absolute core of 20th century history. We're going to break down the Cold War, and specifically, we're looking at that incredibly strange, super tense standoff where two global superpowers basically carved the entire world in half. Now, if you're looking to understand how the modern world's borders and alliances were actually drawn up, well, you're in exactly the right place.
So what makes the Cold War so wildly unusual compared to, say, World War I or World War II? It's that the two main players, the United States and the Soviet Union, never actually fought each other head-on. There was absolutely no direct battlefield between Washington and Moscow. Crazy, right? Yet for nearly 50 years, the entire planet felt like it was sitting on a giant nuclear time bomb. To understand how we even got there, we kind of have to look back to 1945. During World War II, America and the USSR were actually allies fighting against Nazi Germany. But when that war ended, it left behind this massive power vacuum, turning those former allies into bitter rivals locking horns for the next 4 decades. The crucial thing to understand here is that this power vacuum was filled by two radically different visions for how the world should be rebuilt. Let's break down those two visions objectively. On one side, you had the United States pushing for democratic capitalism. This is essentially the belief that free markets, private ownership, and democratic elections are the primary drivers of global peace and economic growth. On the exact opposite side, you had the Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, pushing Marxist-Leninist communism. This system relied on a state-controlled economy and single-party rule. It operated on the belief that capitalism naturally leads to exploitation and war, and therefore, communism literally needed to spread globally in order to survive.
Now, the moment Nazi Germany surrendered, that common enemy vanished. Poof! Suddenly, you had American and Soviet troops standing face to face in the middle of Europe, specifically in Germany. This physical, real-world standoff prompted Winston Churchill to make his famous declaration in 1946, "An Iron Curtain has descended across the continent," and he hit the nail on the head. Europe literally split in two. Eastern Europe fell under Soviet control as satellite states, while Western Europe aligned with the United States.
And those ideological lines, they quickly solidified into formal military alliances. They weren't just ideas anymore. They were officially drawn in stone. In 1949, the Western Bloc formed NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. A few years later, in 1955, the Eastern Bloc countered by forming the Warsaw Pact. What you really should take away from this is the sheer scale of the stakes here. The world was basically rigged like a tripwire. If you touched a single country in NATO, you were instantly at war with America. If you touched a Warsaw Pact country, boom, you were at war with the USSR.
Which brings us to a massive logical puzzle. Ask yourself, how do you fight without starting World War III? I mean, you've got two heavily armed nations, both absolutely determined to see their ideology triumph on the global stage, but they're both fully aware that a direct fight could trigger total global annihilation. So what do? Well, let's dive into this, because the answer is proxy wars. Instead of going punch for punch with each other, they backed opposing sides in other conflicts around the globe. If a civil war or regional conflict broke out in Asia, Africa, or Latin America, the US and Soviet Union swooped in and turned it into a battleground for their own ideologies. Look at the 1950s. The Korean War saw a communist North backed by the Soviets and China, fighting a democratic South backed by the US and the UN. Then the Vietnam War pitched a North Vietnam backed by the USSR and China against a South Vietnam backed by the US. Later on in the 1980s, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan to support a communist regime, while the US secretly funded and armed the Afghan insurgent fighters. So while Europe experienced this tense silent standoff, millions of people were actually fighting and dying in these proxy conflicts all across the world. And hanging over all of these proxy battles was a truly terrifying concept, MAD, or mutually assured destruction. Both superpowers spent these decades building thousands upon thousands of nuclear warheads. MAD was the ultimate horrifying deterrent. It was the absolute guarantee that if one side launched their nuclear weapons, the other side would launch theirs right back in retaliation, and, well, everybody lost. Total annihilation. But there was one specific moment where that whole system of deterrence almost completely broke down. Just 13 days in October of 1962. During this incredibly brief window, the entire world literally held its breath. This was the Cuban Missile Crisis, a massive climax of tension where those theoretical nuclear fears nearly became a sudden, violent reality.
Actually, you know what? The most terrifying number of this entire era is 90. Soviet nuclear missiles were discovered placed in Cuba, which is just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Think about that claustrophobic tension for a second. 90 miles. For 2 agonizing weeks, secret negotiations and military blockades came within mere seconds of triggering an all-out nuclear exchange. It was only diffused when Soviet Premier Khrushchev finally agreed to remove the weapons.
So, after coming that close to the edge, the superpowers had to find other ways to compete. Which leads to our next big question. How do you assert dominance on the world stage when you realize you really truly can't fire a weapon at your main enemy? Well, the answer is that the conflict leaked into literally every other part of human culture. One of the most famous examples of that cultural battleground was the space race. The Soviets secured a massive early victory in 1957 by launching Sputnik, the very first artificial satellite. But America countered this move ultimately and dramatically in 1969 by putting a man on the moon. This wasn't just about science, right? This was a high-stakes arena to prove which ideological system could achieve the impossible.
It even spilled over into sports. When the USA and USSR hockey teams faced off at the 1980 Winter Olympics for the Miracle on Ice, it wasn't just a hockey game. No way. It was treated by both nations and the watching world as a massive, high-stakes ideological showdown. Literally every arena of human achievement was weaponized to prove superiority.
But, as we know, nothing lasts forever, so we have to ask a really critical question. How does a conflict this massive, one that encompasses the entire globe and spans generations, finally come to an end? Well, the answer lies in looking at the internal breaking point of the Soviet system.
By the mid-1980s, the Soviet system started cracking from the inside. They simply couldn't keep up economically. The USSR was spending an astronomical portion of its budget on its military and on keeping up in the nuclear arms race. And this heavy expense? It came at a devastating cost to its own citizens. Consumer goods became incredibly scarce, and the internal economy was fundamentally crippled.
Enter Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985. He recognized these deep economic cracks and tried to save the system by introducing 2 major reforms. The first was glasnost, which translates to openness, basically giving citizens more freedom of speech and political transparency. The second was perestroika, or restructuring, which was an attempt to modernize and decentralize the economy. But there was a catch. Once you give people a taste of freedom after decades of strict state control, you kinda can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. It unleashed an unstoppable momentum.
Protests began sweeping rapidly through Eastern Europe, and history moved incredibly fast. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. That was the ultimate physical symbol of a divided world, and it came down in a single night. A couple of years later, in December 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved, breaking apart into 15 independent nations. Almost overnight, the Cold War was over, and the United States emerged as the world's sole remaining superpower.
But, the story doesn't actually end in 1991. The legacy of the Cold War heavily shapes the world we live in right now. It shaped almost every border, military alliance, and geopolitical rivalry you see in the news today. From the lingering division of North and South Korea to the current, ongoing tensions between NATO alliances and Russia, the ripples of that 45-year standoff are absolutely everywhere.
So I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. Which global tensions in today's news are still echoing from a war that technically never even happened? It's a fascinating lens through which to view modern geopolitics. If you want to understand these echoes better, I highly recommend using this explainer as a jumping-off point to dive deeper into historical sources like the Truman Doctrine or the construction of the Berlin Wall, because the past is never really past, right? It just sets the stage for today. Thanks for learning with us, and keep asking questions.